As a teenager, always had a camera. I was exploring. There was a few places that we kind of navigated towards, old and abandoned. It was popular to start a blog. And it was the first time that we kind of had access to putting our ideas on the internet, and it thrived. Even though it's graffiti, we call ourselves writers. It's Penal Code 594. I'll never forget that. And then we had an exhibit. It was the first time that I was able to see my photos and then my graffiti art on the canvas. So when I was a graffiti artist, I did look for buildings to paint on. So I was exploring with a different perspective. Later on, I started seeing in a perspective as like, I wonder what that building is about. What was it before? And that's when I started digging more into the actual story. And also just meeting the people in the world of preservation. Never thought I would get to know people that want to save these historic buildings. I learned a lot from them as well, and met architects and librarians and archivists. That's been awesome.
Welcome to Angel City Culture Quest, where art, social justice, and the environment meet in Los Angeles. I am your host, Melina Paris, and I welcome you to this episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Angel City Culture Quest. Today, we are chronicling architecture, art, and social justice with Doña Junta, in discussion of Swap Meet Chronicles to the Beyond the Façade podcast. Here's a little information about our guest. Leah, also known as Doña Junta, is a former graffiti artist turned street archivist. Doña Junta runs the social media page Swap Meet Chronicles, which started off as an idea to highlight everyday cultural happenings growing up in a Mexican household. The concept developed into a blog in 2007, in which Doña Junta documented the streets of Los Angeles from graffiti, personal stories, events, and abandoned places. Today, Swap Meet Chronicles, with nearly 4,000 followers, evolved into research on the history of our streets throughout Los Angeles, architecture of buildings, and social issues such as mass incarceration and prison advocacy through photos and research-driven feature stories. In 2020, Doña Junta, with co-host Sabrina Calderon, created a podcast called Beyond the Façade to further discuss these places in detail and interview people who also create content in similar realms. Doña Junta earned a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Cal State Long Beach in 2012 and a Master's in Social Work from Cal State Los Angeles in 2017. Hello, Doña Junta. I'm very happy to have you here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be chatting about my interests.
Yeah. So in another life, Doña Junta said she might have been a librarian or an archivist, hence her research skills. Today we'll discuss some of her history, her time at Slanguage, the de facto art school and artist-run space in Wilmington, California, and her drive to research and discuss architecture, institutional buildings, including what's happening with those structures throughout Los Angeles. We'll also highlight a couple of Beyond the Façade episodes, those being the Sleepy Lagoon murder and the Zoot Riots 78th anniversary, and Ghosts of Our Youth, Abandoned Institutions and the Impact on Los Angeles Youth, which was featured in the 20th anniversary Slanguage exhibition at Angels Gate Cultural Center in, was it September of last year? September, yes. October, right around that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you were raised in San Pedro, but you said
Yes.
You always wanted to get out of town and head to Wilmington, which was like a second home for you.
Yeah.
You liked the city for its raw grittiness, which you note it has to this day. You had said, quote, "I like really ugly and abandoned and really beautiful too. I find the beauty in the ugly or left alone, whatever it is," end quote. So your documentation of places started as a curious child, always taking photos of places or things that interested you with your disposable camera. How old were you when you first started taking pictures?
I would say as a teenager growing up, I always had a disposable camera, whatever ones they sold at Rite Aid. mostly as a teen because my parents didn't own cameras. Then later on, as I got older, the digital era came about. Then I started buying cameras through the years. I mean, not the, SLR or anything like that, just quick digital cameras.
What would you photograph around San Pedro?
With San Pedro, there was a few places that we kind of navigated towards. What I could recall looking back, I really liked Warehouse One with the gargoyles. If you're from San Pedro, you know Warehouse One. It's the original longshoreman area, I guess you want to call for. I would say it was the original port. It's a beautiful concrete building with gargoyles. The gargoyles are basically the spouts. So when it rains, the water comes out of their mouth. So I really love that. And it's always been abandoned that I know of. I mean, it's been shut down. It's used for movies and all that. It's very popular for that. But it was always cool seeing it and like looking around it. So that, and just there's a few buildings. I know that with San Pedro, it's very limited. There's a lot of beautiful houses around town. It's what I got to I explored later on as I got older and started kind of seeing, oh, I like, the Spanish style houses near Averill Park or some of the styles near the coast. But that didn't come till later until I started kind of being more aware of. But growing up, I still was kind of just leaning towards maybe old and abandoned or kind of creepy looking. At one point, the Warner Grand was abandoned.
Yeah.
And I would kind of peek through there. And later on, they finally opened it up. But growing up, it was I was curious about it too.
It's a beautiful building.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what was your blog, Swap Meet Chronicles. How did you come up with that name?
It came out of high school because growing up with immigrant parents, they came here first and, they came here just to survive and start working. And, in those days, it's not like now, everything's so trendy and fashionable. We would have to go to the swap meet to get our clothes, or the mall was around, but, obviously it was more expensive. So it was kind of a tradition to go to the swap meet on Sundays, usually after church. It's just kind of part of the culture, especially during that time. The outdoor swap meet and even later on in the 90s, the indoor swap meets came around.
Yeah.
You buy shoes, jeans for $10. So it was kind of part of what people did or went to at the time. So that kind of always stuck. And when I was thinking of a name for a blog, it just kind of came to mind. And then it was also just with my friends, we joked around a lot about swap meet. It's just kind of a inside type of joke, but yeah, it was part of, culturally speaking, growing up.
So how did the blog get started?
Well, during that era, 2006, 7, maybe not the beginning of it, but like when it was pretty popular to start a blog. And a lot of people I knew had one, or I started discovering people that had one from all over LA, and they would take photos and write about different topics. And it was the first time that we kind of had access to maybe putting our ideas down on the internet, because before you would have to work for a newspaper or television or a magazine. And I just started it because I was taking photos and kind of exploring, and partially because I did like writing, but it was popular during that time and it was a new thing that was coming out and it was free. So Swap Meet Chronicles kind of was created.
And you had the content with your pictures and your thoughts about it. That's cool.
And then from there, I networked and discovered other people, was part of like other groups. It just was an era of the blogging, I guess, before social media.
Yeah. Pre-social media.
Yes.
So when you first started, you said you mostly posted photos of the places and added your opinion of it maybe, but it evolved after you started doing research on the locations and the buildings you covered. Eventually, the Instagram page inspired your podcast, Beyond the Façade. Who is the Beyond the Façade audience?
So just to clarify on that, I stopped blogging about 2010 or so because it kind of faded out. The social media came in and we were busy spending our times on Instagram and Facebook and MySpace, and people's attention span got really short. They weren't going to read my whole blog post. It just wasn't the same. And I noticed that and kind of veered off to social media as well. So I stopped the blogging, and 2019 or so is when I got convinced by my niece, who was 17 years old, that used to read my blog because there were stories about our family and whatnot on there. And she's like, you should bring it back somehow. We all have a personal Instagram, but it was just like personal photos. It wasn't what I was doing on the blog. And she's like, I'll support you. So like, hey, why not? Let me make a public Instagram, the Swami Chronicles. And I did, and it kind of thrived. And from there, I learned more and more, and it started evolving.
You got to feel
But
for
also,
it.
Instagram is limited, right? We could only have so much in the caption.
Yeah.
I mean, now there's video, but it's still 15-second, 30-second video, 1-minute video, right? You can't really get into depth on maybe what I'm speaking about or what I want to get into on the Instagram. So that's why I decided to start the podcast so I could discuss more of what I was either posting on Instagram or other topics, whatever I was interested in more depth with my co-host or whoever I have as a guest. And there was no limit. It just gave more space. The audience, it's people that are interested in history, architecture. I don't only stay in LA history. I mean, I do different places, but I wanted to start with LA first since I'm obviously living here. So I get a lot of people that do like LA history.
That's good. So backing up for a minute, I want to ask, how did you first get into doing graffiti?
So that was back in high school. I would say about 96. Maybe 10th, 11th grade or so. And the reason I did was because there was a group of friends that used to get bused to San Pedro High School from Wilmington. And maybe, I don't know if they got bussed over because they couldn't go to banning or what happened, but we became friends. And later I found out that they were graffiti artists or taggers. I don't know what you want to call it at the time. And during high school, obviously you're influenced by your circle of friends. And they introduced me to a lot of artists and other graffiti writers. And they kind of were like, oh, you should start writing, or we call it writing. Even though it's graffiti, but we call ourselves writers.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I just said, yeah, sure. And that's when they helped me like kind of form a name.
Yeah.
And
what was the name?
The original one was really cheesy. Space Girl.
Oh.
Cross that out. And then later on, one of my friends from Long Beach, he gave me the name Pearl. Perl, not spelled the original way, but with the graffiti world, you kind of spell it like different.
Yeah.
But it's Pearl.
Cool. So what did you paint or write?
Well, the name.
Okay.
So we call it bombing, not bombing like we're going to blow up a building, but subliminally in a way with the art or the graffiti, we would paint our names on the building or it doesn't have to be a building. It could be a billboard. It could be an alleyway. It could be a truck. Anything that seemed like maybe visible, we would put our name on the surface with spray paint. And, we'll use different colors, different styles. People had different ways that they did their letters. And, through time, I got better. Obviously, when you first start, you're a little bit, not that great. And you learn as you go. There's people that did like characters and things like that, but it was mostly our name.
That's interesting because you said it was called bombing, and it made me jump to photo bombing. I wonder if that was where that expression originated from. That's a funny connection.
That's a good question. It just was always something that I knew was called bombing. The origins of it, not so much. I guess just putting your signature out there somehow.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So you said you did this from about 16 to your early 20s, and you said until you were forced not to do it anymore. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Yes. So the reality is with graffiti, it is illegal if you're doing it the street way. Most of the time, graffiti people from New York, it originated from New York. If you watch old documentaries like Subway Art or Breaking, you could see the original 1980s, 1970s graffiti, and they would paint the subway cars illegally. So there is such a thing as legal yards that we used to get permission from, which, did happen occasionally, or later on it did. But originally the goal is just to go paint the city, but the risk is that you could get in trouble, and it is vandalism technically. It's actually 594, Penal Code 594. I'll never forget that. Is the penal code for vandalism. And in my mid-20s, I ended up getting caught painting a train, and that obviously puts a barrier on things.
Yeah.
And it does make you think like, wow, now, they're on to me, or they're on to us. And it's hard to completely stop, but, obviously there's risk to it. And when you're young, you just kind of take the risk, unfortunately, until later on you realize, well, maybe it's not that worth it. But yeah, that's kind of what happened, where the risk got me in trouble.
You said the risk wasn't as important as it was when you got a little older.
No, because at the time I didn't really have a lot of goals as far as, or nothing to lose, I guess.
Yeah.
I have more to lose now, obviously. As we get older, we all have more to lose.
Yeah.
And at the time I didn't, so it didn't feel as risky, or it was fun.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it was a way of expressing yourself.
Yeah.
That's
and
cool.
that did change later on, and where I had to kind of deviate towards doing the art in different ways.
Right. So, well, I have two questions. The first one is, what initiates your research on a particular building? Because I'm thinking about, as you were doing graffiti and you were looking for places to paint that might be of interest, and how that, if it does spill over to your research now to look at a particular building.
So when I was a graffiti artist, I did look for buildings to paint on. And it was mostly for the aesthetic, for me to go put our name or go inside and explore it, to put our names inside. People, like, they go into abandoned places, there's always graffiti in there. And it was always like that. So I was exploring buildings with a different perspective, mostly for graffiti. Later on, when I got older, I started seeing the buildings that I used to go to, or the areas I used to go to, in a perspective as like, I wonder what that building is about. What was it before? And then I started really loving the older architecture of these buildings. Not all of them that we painted were architecturally significant, but a lot of them were. And when I started looking back on my old photos, like, oh, that was a cool building. And I got more interested later as I evolved in architecture and the older styles of buildings.
They're beautiful. They really are.
Yes.
So this was also during the time that Slanguage came into your life. How old were you when you started there?
About 18 or so.
Okay.
Is when I met Mario and Carla, and they had started the studio. It was pretty empty at the time, but it was a place that we could go and draw in black books. And those are books that are just artist books with blank pages. We would cut out stencils and do little projects there. They were obviously fresh out of art school, so they opened the studio to start their career in life. To me and the people maybe I went with at the time was like, oh, it's a cool spot to hang out and, draw.
They accepted you guys in and even tutored you a little bit.
Yes, because they were the first ones that I seen that were educated. I never had known anybody that really gone to school and college that far to get a master's degree or anything. They were pretty inspirational, and they became mentors. Even though it was never officially, oh, you're my mentor, they became that de facto mentors. And because they were able to get educated and become artists and then come back to maybe the neighborhood and share what they learned with us. So that was pretty amazing. You didn't really see that back then.
So it was a really transitional time for you. Can you talk about that transition and about your work with galleries from that point?
Yeah. So during that time, I was just working random jobs. I hadn't gone to school quite yet. I was going to Harbor College and kind of dabbling, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I wasn't taking it seriously. And in 2009, when there was the recession that we had, if people are old and remember,
yeah.
They laid me off. I had a typical customer service job, and it was a blessing in disguise because I was able to focus on school more. And then I was visiting the studio more often to help out or just be around because I had more time now that I wasn't working and I was getting ready to be more serious in school.
That's great.
So it gave me opportunity to be able to go there and be part of different projects with them.
And it got to the point you said you had an exhibit or exhibits at MoCA and at Lola.
So we did a group exhibit at MoCA. It was like a whole thing that Mario did, but we were part of executing it. As far as me and another young lady did kind of a little video on the Wilmington.
Oh.
It's an old video on kind of the history of Wilmington in a sense. We're going around Wilmington taking photos and filming. I don't even know what we used to film at the time, but that was with the whole group. And then later on, I got the opportunity to do more of a collaboration with me and another artist from San Diego at Mola. So it was me from here in LA and then another artist from San Diego. And we had an exhibit at a satellite gallery that Mola had right there in downtown Long Beach. And it was the first time that I was able to like see my photos of these abandoned places and then my graffiti art on the canvas. And we got to paint the wall. And then a lot of the photos I was taking framed. It was a great opportunity. I just wasn't used to it at the time because remember with graffiti, you want to be really anonymous. So that transition was really difficult for me at the time, even though I look at back now and like, wow, that was amazing.
I can imagine. Yeah, that's huge. It is amazing.
The exhibit was called Defiant Chronicles, I believe.
Defiant Chronicles?
Yeah.
That's a cool name.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, hopefully we're going to be able to have an image or two to share from that. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for joining our discussion. Today, we're speaking with Doña Junta of Beyond the Façade podcast. Hello, culture lovers. This is your host, Melina Paris. We have been bringing you inspiring guests along with stimulating content about their work. As with anything, there are costs to keep this podcast going. So if you're able, join me in this quest with your support. Think of it as a cultural tip jar to share any amount that you're comfortable with. Or you can make a regular offering with as little as $4 a month. This will contribute to my ability to continue bringing you the great work of these artists, activists, and others, plus the cultural content that you want to hear about. I appreciate you, and I would be honored to have your support. To join, please go to our Patreon link at patreon.com/Angel City Culture Quest. There, you can also see all of our past episodes, get early announcements, and find more perks to come. Thank you. So, how did you get into sociology?
So when I left Harbor, it was discouraging, I guess, because Harbor College, the counselors were very discouraging. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but they were. So they had told me I should go to like a trade school or beauty school or something like that, that I wasn't meant for academia or nothing.
Not cool.
But I still kept going. And I discovered that I guess I like sociology. And I knew briefly about what it was just from reading, taking, I think, Sociology 1 in Harbor. But I didn't really get into depth of it till I got in and I transferred to Cal State Long Beach and really dove into what sociology was, which I did realize I loved. It was really interesting to me. So that was part of it. And then also, I didn't really know about social work so much, but sociology also deals with issues as far as the family systems and theories on criminology and crime. And I learned a lot of that too from sociology. And I had my internship was at the probation department at one point, and I learned a lot just working there.
You were shadowing officers, right?
Yeah. And also because my husband, when he was younger, was system impacted with probation, and it kind of inspired me to be like, okay, maybe I could go in some realm to help out or like learn about it somehow. I was shadowing youth probation officers, also adult, but a lot of the youth ones. So I was still trying to discover what I wanted, but sociology gave that platform.
And it had an impact on you, clearly.
Yeah.
So you have your interest in architecture, and you said you actually combined it with some of your episodes on Beyond the Façade, where you and Sabrina discuss the historical issues surrounding these buildings. And this includes state carceral institutions, juvenile and adult, and the issues that have taken place there. And that's what really caught my attention at the Slanguage exhibition. Your piece was titled Ghosts of Our Youth, Abandoned Institutions and the Impact on Los Angeles Youth. because you had the image of Juvenile Hall alongside the video of your podcast discussion on how these institutions affected the youth that were there through the decades, but particularly in the 80s and 90s. Now, in that podcast episode, you had noted that the youth in the 90s were charged as adults, and these children were often sent to these places for minor infractions. The youth in the harbor area went to a place called Los Padrinos, or LP, which I think it's in Downey.
Yeah.
Which you noted through gang culture, that place became a badge of honor. And you also both noted in the episode that these structures are mostly hidden behind huge walls, which you guys described the physicality of, as well as how the places look and even how they feel, which is interesting because as a society, we largely don't want to know about them. I think maybe if we did know about them, we wouldn't tolerate it. You also discussed how these places had an impact on you growing up in the 90s because so many people went through them. I was looking at some statistics, hearing what you guys were discussing and then reading up on this issue. It's not good. And I was looking at what's going on with the population in these institutions, inspired from your discussion. The Juvenile Justice Information Exchange, an independent, nonpartisan international digital publication, which covers juvenile justice, in January reported the number of incarcerated youth declined 77% from more than 108,000 in 2000 to about 25,000 in 2020. That's according to the data from the U.S. Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Several studies have linked the youth incarceration with having poor physical and mental outcomes later in life, including increased risk of substance abuse and incarceration as an adult. And further, children of color continue to be disproportionately locked into these facilities. It was a fascinating episode that you guys did on Beyond the Façade, and I'd encourage people to listen to it. Anything you wanted to add about that particular episode?
Yeah, the episode was really inspiring because of the fact that the places we did highlight it, they're all here in LA and they're pretty much kind of relics of this time in the 80s and 90s that there was mass incarceration. I mean, it's still going on now, but it was really prevalent at the time. So just seeing that and being able to dig into the history and just exploring the place now, like kind of feeling the building, going to it now became just fascinating to be able to look more into it. That episode was really looking into maybe places that people don't really care about now, but at the time they were really overflowing with kids and teenagers. They're still there to this day, but just there's only one that's gone, and it took up until 2016 or so to be made into like a whole different thing. And that's Fred C. Nellis, the correctional youth prison in Whittier. But the other ones are still there sitting, and those are being closed more recent.
You were talking about that. I think you mentioned Los Padrinos. One of the buildings there is possibly being used for a women's homeless shelter right now.
Yes, and it wasn't advertised. I only found out from digging more into it when they closed it down, I think 2019 or so. Yes, around that time.
It begs the question, what will ultimately come of these buildings and how we can best put them to use to actually help the communities that they're located in?
Yeah, a lot of times it's hard because these buildings are owned by the county or the state. And there's a lot like a bureaucracy when it comes to the building and maybe selling it to the city and what it's going to be. It's like seems very complicated.
Yeah.
As far as LP, I did hear, like you were saying, that it is a women's shelter, very small portion of it. The rest of it's pretty abandoned still. They haven't said what they're going to do with that. They have talks about some of the other places kind of turning into like the shopping, loft, townhome type of places.
There's a lot of that. But
yeah.
There's other needs. We're hoping we got a new mayor, so maybe some changes will be coming, but we'll see. Which brings me to, real quickly, I just saw, it was last week, the LA Times did an op-ed about juvenile detention centers. And the statistics noted the population in these centers diminished. The Times said that would have been an opportunity to improve rehab programs for the most difficult youth. But instead, fewer cases translated into negligent care, absent staff, and organizational meltdown. The Times reported that LA County Juvenile Hall's staff has only 11% of its workforce coming to work currently, and the probation department is under scrutiny right now by the Board of State and Community Corrections. And the article said that the intervention is needed, or the federal government will again have to come in, as it did more than a decade ago, with civil rights action and a consent decree, possibly. So it doesn't sound like the county is doing what needs to be done in this particular case.
No, it's been an ongoing thing with especially Central Juvenile Hall. That was the last one here in LA. There's Sylmar Juvenile Hall in the city of Sylmar. But Central has been notorious for buildings that are falling apart. They're just very, very bad, horrible conditions. High turnaround rate for staff, like it says there. There's low morale, no rehabilitation or programming. And when they have came down on them to, okay, you got to fix the walls or whatever they got to do in these really, really old buildings, they just never got it done. And a lot of corruption, a lot of abuse as well, too, from staff to the youth.
Yeah.
And it just was not working. And what I had heard last is they shipped all the youth out because they finally put their foot down and needed to shut it down. But they took the youth to Sylmar. But the unfortunate part was that they didn't tell the parents. So on the weekend, when they were supposed to visit, the parents were told their teenagers are not there anymore. And it's just been an ongoing. I don't know if they're back using the building, but there a lot of those things they don't talk about, and it's not exposed in the media. But I hear different things that they're back, they're not back. But that place was supposed to be shut down because of the conditions.
That's sad.
Just like LP.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other episode you did on the Zoot riots.
Yes.
And the murder of 22-year-old Jose Diaz. This was along with the discussion of the Chavez Ravine in its original state. That was a great episode because you guys covered so much and so thoroughly on the circumstances around his murder at Sleepy Lagoon and of his day immediately before that. But you also set up the scene in Los Angeles in 1943 and of Chavez Ravine in its original state. It was a time of war and a time during a large influx of immigrant workers. And you explained how much pride their offspring had, these young Zoot suiters, many of whom felt stuck. They were born here, but they still didn't feel like they belonged. And the Zoot suits exemplified their pride and their style, which was often resented by a lot of white folks at the time, unfortunately. There were so many aspects to that episode between all these subjects, Chavez Ravine, Jose Diaz, and how you described the Zoot suits, which were called drapes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. It was a great episode. How was it investigating all of that?
It was awesome because it's something I heard of kind of in passing, but it was never something taught, at least in high school.
Yeah.
I think I learned about it briefly in a class at Harvard College, Mexican American history, but never too much into detail. And the reason that I got deeply involved in the episode was because the Hall of Justice in downtown LA was a building that I started researching for the Instagram because it has interesting architecture. And then I started finding the photos of the kids that got arrested the night of the Zoot riots. There was a group of at least 20 different boys and girls or teenagers, young adults. And there was pictures of them in front of the Hall of Justice. And I knew it was related to Zoot riots, but I just wanted to know more why, what happened. And that's when I started digging more into the actual story and history and finding out what exactly happened to these youth. Why did they get arrested? Who was Jose? We went down a rabbit hole. Actually, I got this book on the Zoot riots by a professor who studied it very thoroughly. He's from Arizona, I believe. I'll give you the title of the book. I don't know it offhand, but he did a lot of interviews on his take on everything. So I started listening to a lot of interviews with him and also read his book. And then me and my co-host decided, let's just try to trace the footsteps of where these things happened. So the first one was going to the city of what is now Bell. It was where the Sleepy Lagoon was at. It wasn't the city of Bell. Now it's super industrial. You would not be able to tell it was a ravine. There was homes or anything there. It's completely commercial buildings. The LA River that goes across it is cemented, obviously. But just going there and kind of tracing that. And then we discovered a group of people on Instagram that celebrate the Zoot riots every year. They dress up in the the Zoot suits, and then they have their 1940s cars, and they go on a cruise. It's like a whole celebration for the anniversary. So we discovered them, and we happened to join. Let's just go. So that was another part of it. We ended up finding where he was buried, which, because my co-host is really in touch with paranormal and we love cemeteries, old cemeteries and things like that, we ended up finding out he was buried not far here in a Catholic cemetery in East LA. So we went to go visit him and take him flowers and kind of just go through the different steps from what we learned from the story of what happened. So part of it was there was a lot of injustice for these kids. They went to some of the institutions that I have talked about before. Most of them went to San Quentin, but some of the girls went to the juvenile institutions. Some of the girls were tried without due process. So it was a big controversial thing at the time. So it was amazing to be able to like navigate the places and this history that maybe we didn't really learn about. And it was related to Chicanos, like people that were born here, like myself, that had immigrant parents back in the 1940s. So really a deep connection with that history.
Yeah, you brought it full circle.
Yeah.
Like you said, by visiting his grave and bringing the flowers and going to Sleepy Lagoon and even describing his day before that. And it was his birthday and everything. It was
very ironic.
Yeah, it was a whole full circle episode, which you guys do a lot of. So kudos for that.
Thank you.
So lastly, can you tell us what inspires you about architecture to take all these photos and share?
I just love the architecture of the past because it just has more character. It had a more sturdiness, more passion to it. It's just not like today. And maybe some people love the modern architecture of today, but I can't relate to it just yet because a lot of it seems really Home Depot-ish. That's what I call it. Maybe there's stuff that environmentally more safer, right? Compared to maybe like something that might have asbestos 1920s or whatnot. Right. But I don't know, architecture and architects and people that designed at the time, they just put more details into it and material was better. And I just love seeing those relics from the past still standing today.
Yeah.
So I used to really hate like the 60s and 70s, but now that 70s is 50 years ago or more.
I know.
As cheesy as it could be, I love it now. Love and hate, like 70s funky architecture. But I rather see that than seeing like a same building that they build across town that looks the same.
Exactly. The Home Depot building.
Yes, Home Depot buildings.
Yeah. So can you please tell us what's coming up next on Beyond the Facade and where we can find you?
Yes. So we are dropping an episode tomorrow, and we talk about Camarillo State Hospital in Ventura, which is a Spanish colonial or mission revival building, but it's architecturally significant. And now it is a university, but it's more paranormally significant. My co-host and another guest that we had explored it more than 10 years ago. And there's a documentary my friend did on it, on the very heavy paranormal activity that has happened at that place due to its history of mental institution and the way they treated people. And I'm sure it has a lot to do why it's very active. If you believe it or not, one of my friend Wayne Poe, he was a big skeptic, didn't believe in none of that until he started actually investigating and filming it for his documentary. So definitely look out for that episode. Drops tomorrow, and you can learn more about it if you never heard about it, and then watch his documentary as well. A couple other things too. One of the goals is to try to get more in the field, get more interviews, actually go out there and film ourselves exploring the places. And hopefully we could do that by the end of the year. It's been a busy year for all of us. So
yeah,
but that is something that we do want to get going and do more interviews with people that are interested in this type of work too. Like they have their own niche audience. End of January, I had a meeting with other Instagram historians. We had a little coffee date and it was fun because each of us have this really cool interest in history and all this stuff. But everybody does it in their own unique way. So I got to really enjoy networking with other people through what I have done. I also got connected with the Art Deco Society. One of the buildings I took a picture of in South Central, Art Deco building, they really caught interest in it. It's the Hoffman Candy Company, and we're trying to get it to be a historic landmark. Been about a year or so, but we're trying to get that going.
What street is that on?
It's off Avalon in South Central, like Avalon between Gage and Slauson. It's called the Hoffman Candy Company. It used to be back in the 20s and 30s. They're the ones ones that made Couple Gold and a couple other old school candy. And now it's a jean factory. It's been a factory for years since the candy company closed, but it has the original Art Deco facade, very nice for a warehouse. And we're trying to get it on the registry for the city of LA. It's going great.
That sounds fascinating. When I think of all your content and the work that you've done over the years, you've also come full circle in a lot of ways. You've started out taking photos as a kid to, quote, bombing or writing on the walls, to getting interested in architecture and then getting interested in the people in the institutional buildings and having a career to help those kids. And now you're sharing it out to the world with your podcast and your Instagram. So thank you for sharing all of this with us. It's really fascinating information.
And also just meeting the people in the world of preservation that preserve some of these buildings now. And that's been awesome. Never thought I would get to know people that want to save some of these historic buildings. So I learned a lot from them as well, and met architects that
That's
maybe
cool.
I thought I wanted to be one day, but and librarians and archivists.
Yeah, in another life.
Yeah, but you can find me. So my Instagram is on swapme_chronicles. We have the podcast Instagram, just Beyond the Façade podcast, also on Instagram. And we do have a YouTube channel with the Beyond the Façade podcast where we record the episode. So if you like audio, it's going to be on Spotify and most of those platforms. If you're more visual, you can see visual photos and stuff like that. It'll be on YouTube. And Sabrina as well, she's my co-host. Hers is Observing Spooks and Other Vices because she leans towards the paranormal, but also loves the history.
It works very well. Well, Doña Junta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.